The sudden cessation of devastating hostilities across Europe in May 1945 did not usher in an immediate era of peace and stability for millions of victims. Instead, it immediately triggered a vast, chaotic human crisis. The collapse of the Third Reich left behind an enormous population estimated at between 11 to 13 million people who found themselves utterly displaced, far from their countries of origin, their families, and their former lives. These individuals were collectively labeled the Displaced Persons, DPs, a diverse group comprising former slave and forced laborers, emaciated concentration camp survivors, recently liberated prisoners of war, POWs, political prisoners, and millions of ordinary civilians who had fled the relentless ravages of ground combat and aerial bombing. Their immediate, precarious fate was to be gathered into massive, hastily organized displaced persons camps, often depressingly housed in former Nazi SS barracks, captured German military bases, or, in a haunting historical irony, within the very perimeter of former concentration camp structures. These camps, initially established and managed by the overwhelmed Allied military forces, quickly solidified into functional, transitional societies, existing in a critical, prolonged limbo between the horrors of persecution and the elusive hope of permanent resettlement. The initial, overwhelming priority, immediately confronting the liberating Allied military forces, was the monumental task of providing immediate relief, which centered urgently on feeding the starving, providing specialized, urgent medical care for the sick and wounded, and beginning the initial, necessary process of identifying and processing the massive population. This massive logistical undertaking was centrally managed and coordinated primarily by the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. In the chaotic, immediate first weeks following Germany's surrender, the DPs were broadly and quickly categorized based on their nationality. The Western DPs, comprising individuals from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, were the easiest to process and were quickly repatriated, often within a matter of weeks, as they were generally eager to return to their stable, non-Soviet-aligned homelands. However, the much larger, politically charged, and logistically complex issue involved the Eastern DPs, individuals from Poland, the Baltic states, and Soviet territories. The overwhelming majority of the DPs, who were subsequently deemed unrepatriable for various reasons, were the traumatized Jewish Holocaust survivors. Upon their agonizing liberation from the concentration and death camps, many survivors quickly discovered the devastating news that their original homes had been utterly destroyed, their life savings and property violently seized, or their entire families tragically annihilated. Compounding this trauma, many faced the immediate, terrifying reality of intense, violent anti-Semitism in their countries of origin, especially chillingly evident in post-war pogroms in Poland, such as the Kielce pogrom. Because they literally had nowhere safe or welcoming to return to, and definitively refused to go back, these survivors formed the moral and political core of the entire DP crisis, forcing the Allies to reluctantly recognize a distinct, legally separate category of displaced persons who could not and would not be politically or physically compelled to return to their pre-war nations of origin. In the latter half of 1945, the newly established, globally mandated United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, formally took over the primary management and complex administration of the burgeoning DP camps from the initial military oversight. UNRWA staff, consisting of international volunteers, dedicated nurses, seasoned administrators, and aid workers from numerous nations, brought a critically needed humanitarian focus and a long-term perspective to the camp operations. UNRWA provided the crucial, essential resources: consistent food supply, necessary clothing, structurally sound shelter, comprehensive medical services, and vital basic education. The camps themselves rapidly evolved into functional administrative cities, often featuring local DP-run governments, internal police forces, operational schools, and organized medical facilities, though they always remained under the ultimate necessary security authority of the Allied military zones. Daily life within the numerous DP camps was perpetually characterized by immense psychological uncertainty and material scarcity, yet it was also marked by an extraordinary surge of self-determination and proactive cultural revival. The Jewish DPs, in particular, organized themselves into incredibly cohesive, resilient communities, forming the influential Central Committee of Liberated Jews with the explicit mandate to lobby for their rights, negotiate with Allied authorities, and aggressively push for their collective emigration to British-controlled Palestine. These camps rapidly established thriving, vibrant cultural institutions. Newspapers were printed using salvaged presses, theatrical groups rehearsed and performed, and crucial vocational schools opened. These camps became vibrant, though temporary, micro-societies determined to collectively reclaim and reconstruct the entire cultural identity that Nazism had so viciously tried to eradicate. The most politically sensitive, difficult, and morally brutal aspect of the post-war crisis involved the mandatory practice of forced repatriation. Under secret agreements made by Allied leaders at the infamous Yalta Conference, the Western Allies were legally obligated to return all Soviet citizens, including prisoners of war and civilian forced laborers, to the Soviet Union, regardless of their intense personal fear or stated unwillingness. This morally contentious policy, later informally known as Operation Keelhaul, forcibly returned millions, including many who held legitimate fears of immediate persecution, summary execution, or long-term imprisonment, as traitors or collaborators under the highly paranoid Stalin's regime. The resistance to forced repatriation by Polish, Baltic, and Yugoslav DPs was often intense, sometimes tragically leading to violent confrontations and even suicides, exposing a major, irreversible moral failure of the immediate post-war political settlement. The camps specifically designated for Jewish DPs swiftly became the clandestine nerve centers for the Ha'apala, Bi-Riha movement, the highly organized underground effort to facilitate the illegal, massive clandestine emigration of Jewish survivors and refugees to British-controlled Palestine. Thousands of dedicated young men and women within the DP population and external aid networks smuggled DPs out of the official camps, guided them covertly across numerous European borders, and organized their passage onto often rickety, overcrowded ships bound for the Middle East. This strategic, illegal emigration movement was absolutely vital in creating immense international pressure on the British Mandate government and aggressively highlighting the critical, urgent, and non-negotiable need for a sovereign Jewish homeland. The sheer, protracted length of time many DPs were forced to spend living in conditions of precarious limbo was a major defining factor of the crisis. Many found themselves residing in the camps for anywhere between 5 to 10 years. The necessary demand for stability and organization led to the spontaneous development of robust, sophisticated, internal administrative structures. DPs formed their own, accountable camp police forces for internal order, established formalized religious organizations, synagogues, churches, mosques, and developed highly effective vocational training programs, often supported by UNRWA. These crucial programs explicitly taught practical, marketable skills like precision carpentry, tailoring, welding, and electrical work, successfully preparing the DPs for eventual life and immediate employment in their future host countries. The most prominent and challenging health crisis initially encountered by the DPs was the devastating, widespread presence of tuberculosis, TB, which was tragically rampant due to years of sustained starvation, profound exhaustion, physical abuse, and forced labor under horrific, unsanitary conditions. Allied military doctors and UNRWA medical staff launched massive, coordinated public health campaigns, immediately instituting isolation wards and systematically improving nutrition and sanitation to aggressively combat the deadly infectious disease. Furthermore, the immense debilitating psychological toll of the Holocaust and prolonged war trauma was widespread and deeply rooted. though the devastating effects of post-traumatic stress disorder were not yet fully understood or systematically treated by the medical authorities of the time. The persistent global political impasse over mass resettlement and immigration effectively kept the DPs imprisoned and waiting in the camps for years. Most potential host countries, including the influential United States, were initially hesitant to accept large, sudden numbers of European refugees immediately after the war, due to a complex mixture of lingering isolationist political sentiments, intense economic fears regarding job competition, and the continuation of strict anti-immigration policies. The frustratingly slow pace of international diplomatic negotiations and the profound lack of unified political will among the major powers ensured that the temporary emergency camps rapidly and tragically transitioned into long-term, semi-permanent settlements for a lost generation. The major, crucial turning point in official U.S. immigration policy regarding the DPs came with the eventual passage of the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. This landmark, though controversial, act finally allowed an initial quota of 200,000 DPs to legally immigrate to the United States over a subsequent 2-year period, a quota that was later generously extended to include over 400,000 immigrants by 1952. While providing a crucial, necessary outlet for resettlement, the act was initially heavily criticized for placing preferential requirements, e.g., favoring specific ethnic groups and agricultural workers, and imposing a retrospective cut-off date that often disproportionately disadvantaged the neediest Jewish DPs, requiring later important amendments to rectify the biases. The creation of the State of Israel in May 1948 immediately provided the most significant, definitive, and comprehensive solution for the majority of the Jewish DP population in Europe. Upon the declaration of statehood and the successful conclusion of the War of Independence, Israel immediately opened its doors under the law of return, which fundamentally guaranteed automatic citizenship to any Jew seeking refuge. Tens of thousands of Jewish DPs immediately began a massive, orchestrated wave of emigration, aliyah, from the camps to Israel, viewing the new, fledgling nation as their only true, safe, and final destination after the horrors they had endured, rapidly emptying the majority of the Jewish-occupied camps. Beyond the Jewish population, the remaining large segments of DPs, primarily comprising individuals from the Baltic nations, Poland, and other Eastern European states, were highly sought after by distant countries actively undergoing post-war industrial expansion. Nations such as Canada, Australia, Argentina, and Brazil were in desperate need of both skilled and unskilled labor to fuel their own rapidly expanding post-war industrial and agricultural economies. These nations often implemented strict, targeted screening and recruitment programs, actively seeking and recruiting young, healthy, and educated DPs directly from the structured camp labor pools, offering them immediate opportunities for employment and permanent resettlement. The complex, uncomfortable issue of war criminals and collaborators often regrettably intersected with the establishment and population of the DP camps. The Allied forces were under intense pressure to establish rigorous, effective screening processes to proactively prevent former Nazis, SS members, or individuals who had actively collaborated with the regime from entering the lucrative resettlement pipeline to the West. However, these initial screenings were frequently imperfect, inconsistent, or deliberately evaded, leading to historical cases where some individuals with profoundly tainted histories successfully managed to immigrate alongside genuine victims, creating complex legal and ethical controversies decades later. The children of the DP camps, often movingly referred to as the She'erit HaPleita, the surviving remnant, represented a generation tragically born into an unnatural state of administrative limbo. Despite the immense material difficulties and the persistent lack of resources, the DP communities and UNRWA absolutely prioritized education. DPs established makeshift schools using salvaged materials, managed to print rudimentary textbooks in their diverse native languages, Yiddish, Polish, Lithuanian, etc., and passionately taught subjects related to their specific cultural heritage, thereby ensuring that the next generation would not lose its precious identity despite the systemic destruction they had witnessed. The crucial and sustained role of various religious and ethnic aid societies became fundamentally central to the DP's eventual successful assimilation and integration. Organizations such as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, CHIAS, the powerful National Catholic Welfare Conference, NCWC, and the Lutheran World Federation provided vital direct services. They arranged sponsorship, managed complex documentation, delivered direct financial assistance, and offered crucial cultural orientation and resettlement services, acting as the indispensable, life-saving bridge between the extended, temporary life in the camps and successful, productive integration into their new host countries. The physical and administrative state of the camps themselves evolved dramatically over their prolonged existence. Initially run under harsh military discipline and strict curfews, by the period of 1947-1948, many had transitioned into much softer, semi-autonomous settlements. Infrastructure saw gradual improvement. Better, more permanent housing was constructed, and the DPs themselves successfully took increasing control over the daily administration, security management, and even the internal judicial systems within their own camp communities, which were often strictly segregated based on nationality or political affiliation for organizational ease. The protracted fate and existence of the DP camps rapidly became a significant, symbolic flashpoint in the growing, tense atmosphere of the Cold War. The Soviet Union continuously viewed the Western-run camps as dangerous breeding grounds for anti-communist elements and aggressively demanded the forcible return of all remaining Eastern European nationals. The Western Allies, however, increasingly and publicly recognized their crucial humanitarian obligation to protect those who genuinely feared persecution, skillfully using the persistent existence of the camps to dramatically highlight the ideological divide and the lack of basic human freedom behind the imposing Iron Curtain. The massive humanitarian relief effort was vast in scale and required the sustained cooperation of dozens of nations, military authorities, and international non-governmental organizations. Private donations from ordinary citizens in the US and other Western nations were channeled through private relief groups, providing urgently needed clothing, specialized medical supplies, and educational materials that the cash-strapped UNRWA and military administrations could not always supply in the required adequate volume. This unprecedented mobilization of global charity and compassion demonstrated an unparalleled collective response to the massive human tragedy unfolding across Europe. A significant number of DPs from the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were particularly vocal and highly resistant to any form of repatriation, viewing their homelands as permanently and illegally annexed by the Soviet Union. These highly organized, strongly anti-communist groups formed influential political lobbying groups and cultural organizations within the camps, advocating internationally for the non-recognition of Soviet annexation and aggressively pushing their members into the Western resettlement programs, aiming to preserve their national identity abroad. The challenging transition from the institutionalized routine of camp life to the competitive economic environment of a host country was immensely difficult for many. DPs faced the significant hurdles of language barriers, the lack of recognized professional credentials, often lost or destroyed, and the intense psychological difficulty of adjusting to the unstructured realities of normal civilian life after years of profound trauma and institutionalized living. Aid societies played an absolutely crucial role in providing essential temporary housing, initial job placement, and necessary cultural assimilation and language programs to ease this jarring transition. The entire painful legacy of the DP camps led directly to the formal creation of the International Refugee Organization, IRO, in 1947, which was explicitly designed to replace the temporary mandate of UNRWA. and inherited the overwhelming responsibility for the remaining DPs. The IRO was the first permanent global organization dedicated solely to managing all subsequent refugee crises, successfully establishing the crucial legal, procedural, and humanitarian framework that would eventually lead to the foundation of the modern-day, highly influential UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. The long-term economic impact of the DPs on their new host countries was overwhelmingly and demonstrably positive, proving the critics wrong. Contrary to initial widespread economic fears, DPs did not deplete resources, but instead supplied a highly valuable, much-needed injection of skilled and semi-skilled labor into the post-war economies. Their high levels of professional ambition, intense work ethic, and determination, often fueled by years of collective deprivation, quickly made them economically successful, entrepreneurial, and highly productive members of their new societies, contributing disproportionately to the post-war boom. The final official DP camps were not officially closed and decommissioned until the later date of 1952. By this time, the vast majority of the residents, totaling several million people, had been successfully processed, resettled, and integrated into dozens of countries globally, marking the official end of the immediate, massive post-war refugee crisis in Europe. This massive, meticulously coordinated resettlement of millions of displaced people stands today as one of the largest, most complex, and ultimately successful humanitarian undertakings in the entirety of modern history. The history of the displaced persons camps serves as a powerful, enduring, and morally complex reminder of the tragic human toll of total warfare and the fundamental, non-negotiable importance of sustained international cooperation, unified political will, and dedicated humanitarian aid in the face of mass displacement. The DP's collective perseverance in successfully rebuilding their individual lives, restoring their culture, and forging a new identity against overwhelming systemic odds remains an indelible testament to the profound resilience of the human spirit.